Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Okay, also I run the websites devnursery.com. Okay, where you can find lots of video tutorials, cheat sheets, blog tutorials, okay, on my blog. And then you can also find a lot of the same blog articles over there at GarokOverflow.com, which also has my blogs, a nice listing of good coding podcasts if you're interested in that, and again a listing of all like my different video playlists. So whatever you want to learn, I got videos on it. Okay, but in this series, what I want to do is talk about Solid Start. I'm really excited about this project. I've been pretty excited about Solid all the way around. But Solid is a front-end framework. And there's a lot going on with Solid, but essentially the easiest way to think about it is that it's similar to Svelte in the sense that it uses compilation. So instead of shipping a framework with your final application, what it does is that it's going to read the code you wrote and compile it to just standard web code. So essentially you're not shipping a framework, you're shipping just the code you need to run your application, which results in smaller, faster bundle sizes. But also what's really cool about the way Solid works is that its reactivity is very granular through the use of what's called an effect. So the idea is that you have certain signals, which are like your state, if you think about like React or pretty much any other framework. You have your signals, and then you have effects, and then effects can basically observe a signal. Okay, so instead of having the whole component re-render every time any state changes, kind of like in React, what you do is you can just have certain designated effects happen again anytime a subscribed signal changes. Which in a lot of different use cases, it's going to feel pretty much the same as you're used to with any like Vue, React, Svelte. But again, what's happening under the hood allows it to make those reactive changes a lot more granularly, so you get also a speed bonus from that, but allows you to feel like you're using JSX in the same way you would with React. Okay, so basically, it makes it really easy to switch over from React because it feels a lot like with React with JSX, but it gives you a lot of the benefits of Svelte, plus it's a little bit, but because of the way they use signals and effects, you get a much more granular reactivity. So it's really, really cool. Now, Solid Start is the meta framework built on top of Solid. So in the same way that Next.js is built on top of React, or Nux is built on Vue, or SvelteKit is built on Svelte. I always forget what the Angular one's called. Let me see here. Let's just do that quick Google search again. Angular meta framework. I know there's like Scully, which is like a static site generator, but Analog. Okay, Analog is the one for Angular because I haven't actually tried that one out yet. I've tried out Scully. I've tried out Scully. Okay, so in this video series, what I want to do is just kind of go over how to use Solid Start. So it's a really cool framework. If you've used Next, if you use Nux, if you use SvelteKit, you kind of know what the deal is in the sense that it allows you to build the whole application, back end and front end, in one nice package that's really centered around that framework. And this allows you to do that with Svelte, which is going to allow you to do static site rendering, server-side rendering, client-side rendering. But always the trick is kind of like knowing when the framework is doing which. Okay, so that's always kind of like the part. So again, you get all these kind of features with it. Client-side rendering, which just means that the actual manipulation of the DOM is going to occur on the client. You have server-side rendering, where that initial HTML that the page is going to load is going to get generated on the server. You have streaming server-side rendering, and now this is particularly interesting and kind of a newer pattern, where the changes you're going to make to the page happen on the server, but instead of rebuilding a whole new page and loading a whole new page, you're just kind of like swapping out sections of the page as those requests get triggered. And static site generation, where you basically pre-render the page. So it's kind of like what you're doing with server-side rendering, but instead of happening on the request by the user, when the user types in the URL, you're doing this at some pre-designated point in time, and then deploying the static assets that get created. So you have all this flexibility all in one framework, okay? So that's generally the benefit of these meta frameworks. So you get all this flexibility to build the application in a way that's going to work best for your use case. Instead of just using the front-end framework alone, which only pretty much allows you to build a single-page client-side rendered application, which is great for certain use cases, but not all. This allows you to kind of really be able to use that framework for everything. in a nice bundled package. Okay, so now that we spent a lot of time explaining what is Solid Start, let's actually start a project. Okay, so throughout this video sessions, we'll kind of go through many of these, pretty much of the documentation as we can. So in this first video, let's focus on routing and setting up the project. So here we go. I have opened up a empty folder in Visual Studio Code. You want to start with an empty folder because it's going to generate the project in the folder. So unlike like using Create React App, where it's going to create a new folder with the project, it'll create the project right in the folder that you run. So just to avoid any kind of complications, I'm going to delete this VS Code folder. That's just generated because I use this extension called Peacock that gives all the colors that you saw a second ago that just disappeared. We're going to open up a new terminal, and you should be using pnpm with Solid Start, which you could install by just doing like sudo npm-g pnpm, or which sudo npm install. And what pnpm is it allows you to work with npm packages like you would with npm, but works more like Ruby gems in the sense that when you install a Ruby gem, you're not installing it every single time you start a new Ruby project. They generally have all these gems kind of stored in one place, and then you're just reusing them from project to project. So pnpm does the same thing. So you don't have to like keep reinstalling everything every single time. But you can also create the new solid project by doing npm create solid. This would be the equivalent of me typing in npm init solid. So either one works. Either one will get you to the same place. Okay, but pnpm create solid. That's going to trigger the basically create the new app script. You're going to have all these different templates to use if you want. So you have bear, which is what we're going to use. Okay, here's like an example of a to-do app. Then here's an example with a bunch of different like things already kind of built in there already. We're just going to use bear. Okay. Now the question is, do you want server-side rendering? I'm going to say yes. But if you choose no, then it's going to be a static app. So if you're building like a blog or something like that, then you probably don't want the server-side rendering because you just want to generate all those assets up front at build time. But if you're building an app that's going to have like a lot of users and like the user information is going to be changing constantly, so you want to basically render those like user-based pages on the fly, you're probably going to want server-side rendering. So I'm going to say yes. Do you want to use TypeScript to keep things simple? I'm going to say no. Okay, and then you get this project. Okay, now again, all that is my skeleton. I still got to install the libraries, so I would do pnpm install, and that's just going to install everything that's in the package.json. Okay, for me, it should be pretty quick because I've already installed everything before. That's a great thing about pnpm. You don't necessarily have to reinstall everything every single time. Okay, and now we're all set to go. Okay, so I was able to install all those dependencies once, get done a lot faster. Okay, now, cool. So let's just kind of give you the setup. So you have a public folder, which is generally where you would put your public assets. It's pretty similar to pretty much any framework you've probably used. Okay, so things like the fav icon and any other kind of like static assets like photos, images you might put in there. Here we have the source folder. Okay, so the way this is going to work is that you have these like entry client folders. So this is just basically what starts up the client side of things and the server side of things. You really shouldn't need to touch these unless you're doing like more advanced configuration of the framework. Okay, here we have the root.jsx. This is just kind of like what sets up that initial page that gets rendered. Okay, again, initially you probably don't need to touch this. Okay, unless you need to do something particular. Okay, but otherwise you can kind of just like leave this alone. Now, what's going to happen is then you go to routes. That's going to be where you set up your different unique pages. So essentially what's going to happen is that every time you render a page, essentially that page, which is in the routes folder, whatever component you're exporting from here gets injected here in this page. Okay, so essentially this is like the master page, the root.jsx, and then you're injecting the content of the particular route here. Okay, and it starts off with two initial routes. So there's this 404 route, so that's just kind of like your error page. So kind of like, hey, someone types in a URL that doesn't exist. This will be your catch-all 404 page. And that's what, so basically, again, the square brackets always means like a variable. And the ... means just like any possible thing. Okay, so 404. And index.jsx, that's going to be our main page. So routes/index.js. This is going to use file-based writing. So if you've done Next, if you've done Nux, if you've done SvelteKit, you're probably familiar with file-based routing where the actual URL of the page is based on the file name. So let's actually run the server. So we're going to do npm run dev. And the nice thing here is that it's going to tell you exactly what routes have been created. So you have page routes and you have API routes. So API routes are generally going to be like your typical like backend API routes if you want to build like an API. And then you're going to have page routes, which are actual like generate HTML pages. Okay. So now if I go over here to the browser and we go to localhost 3000, okay, there you get your basic sort of page. Okay. Now what if I want to create, so right now again, this index.jsx and routes is for this URL, just the basic URL. So what if I want to make a page for /cheese? Right now there isn't a page for /cheese. So watch what happens when I go to /cheese. I get the 404 page, page not found. So if I want to create a page for cheese, all I do is I go inside the routes folder, and I have two possible ways I could do this. I could either create a cheese.jsx. Okay, this would work. So then what I would do is I would export. The export default is always the page. So for that file, the page that would be rendered if I go to that URL is going to be the export default. So I'm going to do export default, and I'm going to export an async function. Actually, I don't even think it needs to be async, just a function. And then we're going to call this cheese, which again theoretically would receive props. And then we can just return h1. Okay, this is the cheese page. So that's the component. Okay. So that's there now. Okay, so now this is going to like restart. And then now we should see like, see now we have this new route because it sees that file in there. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that means we now have a route for /cheese. So now if I go to /cheese, if I refresh this, let me do a shift refresh. Yeah, see it says that this is the cheese page because it's rendering that component. Okay, there. Okay, so that's, but the thing is that's not only by the file name, I could also create a folder. So another way I could do this, I could create a folder called cheese, but then I can move this file inside the cheese folder, but instead of calling it cheese.jsx, I call it index.jsx. So an index.jsx in a folder is still going to be treated in the same way that a file by that name is treated. So again, if I go scroll down, I still have that cheese route. But now I can create other pages in /cheese. So like I can like create a copy of this. Copy, paste, we'll rename this Gouda. Okay, and then we'll call this in this page. Let's change this to Gouda. And this is the Gouda page. And now let's take a look at, and if I scroll way to the bottom, I should see I have a new route. Look, see, cheese/Gouda. Because it's inside routes is treated as a slash, cheese, so /cheese, and then Gouda.jsx. Okay, so you're trying to see like the pattern of how the routes are determined. And then if I go in there and I type in /cheese/Gouda, see this is the Gouda page. Okay. Now, what if I want to create like something for like whatever other page shows up? Okay, then what I can do is I can create a params page. So the way that would work is I would create a new file. Okay, so let's create a new file. Okay, and in here, what I would do is I would create a page, use square brackets, so whatever the square brackets name, and then whatever word you put in the square brackets would be the variable that the param is saved in. So I'm going to call it param, and then we would call this .jsx. Okay, and then again I can export default function. We'll call this, you know, cheese param. It's going to receive props. I'm going to say h1 the cheese param page, and I'm just going to console log props just to do so. Okay, this should be returned. So return there. Okay, and then if I scroll down, now we should see that we have another route, and see it's a colon param, meaning because it's what I have to type in is not param, that's a variable. So now if I typed in instead of cheese/Gouda, if I typed in cheese/Munster, see I'm getting the cheese param page. A little like triggering some sort of error there. Okay. found the page, but for some reason I'm still getting the 404 page at the same time. That's interesting. Okay, but the cheese param page, let me check the here. There should be a console log somewhere. Can I read the properties of no? Let's refresh. Okay. Okay, and then we're getting nothing in props. Okay. And see, it's running the route, but it's still running this, hitting this 404 page, which is interesting. I have to kind of see as to why. I mean, technically it would catch all, but you think it would, once it matches this, it wouldn't do this. So that's an interesting thing. But again, just keep in mind, the Solid Start framework is currently in beta, so there are probably still little minor things that they're working on. But yeah. Okay, cool. But now let's talk about how to get the param. Okay, so for that, let's actually take a look at the documentation. Okay, so let's see here. We have our routing, and right now what we just created was called a dynamic route. Okay, so what going to want to do is we're going to want to import this hook, use params to go get that params from the URL. So basically what we have to do is we're going to go here and import use params from solid start. Okay, and then what we can do is we can say const params equals use params, and then let's console log the params object so we can actually see that in action. Okay, now notice where this console log shows up, just because I want to make something clear, because this took I spent way too long figuring this out, or for this to click with me when I was playing with this. Okay, so if I go back over here, we're gonna refresh the page. Okay, user params. I never said user params. Yep, I did. I mistyped. Okay, let's refresh. Use params is not defined. We go back to the docs here. Use params from solid start. Okay. It says that doesn't exist. Oh, because I typed user params here. There we go. Let's try this again. There we go. Okay. So we see this object there, but if I go over here, param still doesn't have the params in there. It should. Interesting. Cheese / monster. Target prototype. String get. Okay, so there's a get method in there. So I'm gonna assume we're gonna have to use that get method to get the param. Let me just actually take a look at the docs, see if that's exactly params.id. Okay, let's just give it a shot. So theoretically what should happen is that this should say, if I do this, so we're going to inject a variable params dot, and again the param should be called param, because again that's what we refer to it as here. So I should be able to access this params object should allow me to access the params from the URL. So let's see if it lets us do that. Okay, so if I go back over here, and it does work. The monster page, okay. Cool, because it's a proxy object, and again, if you're not familiar with a JavaScript proxy object, is that that's not the actual object with the data. It's a proxy. It allows you to access. So what the proxy does really has custom methods to access some other object in a special way. This is kind of how Vue does a lot of its reactivity with proxy objects. I do have videos on where I show you how to create a proxy object and use it, but I'm not gonna get into that here. Okay, but you see I can access the param. So now I can type in anything I want. So I can type in something like, well, not Gouda. Let's try Swiss. And see, it's going to use that param on every page. So that's how I would create something if I want to create if you're familiar with doing CRUD routes, how I would do a show route where make sure I access it does a unique page for each product based on the product ID in the URL. Okay, so that's how params work. So now we've seen how to use params. And let's see here. Anything else I want to kind of mention before? That's pretty good as far as routing. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Now, one last thing I will show is if we want to link to a page. So if I go back to the cheese page, And let's say I want to make this a div h1, the cheese page. Let's say I want to link two different cheeses. Okay, what I can do is I can import, okay, the a tag. Okay, and now with the a, so this is basically a solid version of the normal a HTML tag. The only difference is that this is for you linking to other pages, other routes in the same application. So if I was linking to like google.com, I would use like a lowercase a tag, like you would normally do in HTML. But in this case, since I'm linking to another route, so that way I can take full advantage of not necessarily switching pages, what I can do is this. I can do like a, and it still works the same. So href equals, and we'll say, you know, slash cheese slash Munster, and then type in here Munster. Okay, now if I go to the page, let's go to the cheese page. So we got the cheese page, and then we have this link. And see, if I click on it, it updates the route and changes the page, but I'm not necessarily doing a whole new page load. It's actually going to sort of, it's going to take advantage of that sort of like, it's going to make those changes client side. It might actually even take advantage of that server streaming in a sense, where basically it'll go get that page from the server, and then swap it out. I'm not quite sure which one it's doing. I think it might depend on whether you have server-side rendering on or off at the time. But you're going to get a much faster experience when you're using that a tag between different like routes. Cool. So that's essentially the basics of just using SolidStart, like how the routing works. I'll see you guys in the next video, and we'll start exploring like API routes.